The year was 1891, and the Dakota Territory was a land of vast, unforgiving plains that stretched like an endless sea of golden grass under a sky that seemed to touch the horizon. The wind, a constant abrasive force, whispered secrets through the tall blades, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. But for Emily Harper, it carried only the weight of despair. Every gust felt like a chilling reminder of her profound, sudden solitude. She clutched her worn leather suitcase in one hand, its corners smoothed by years of travel, and carefully cradled her sleeping infant daughter, Amelia, in the other. The baby's soft, even breaths were the only thread connecting Emily to a world that had turned irrevocably cold and cruel. Emily had come from the East, where the cities buzzed with the mechanical promise of progress and opportunity. Yet tragedy had stripped her of every comfort and prospect. Her husband, Thomas, a kind man with a restless spirit who dreamed of staking a fortune in the West, had succumbed to a virulent fever just weeks after they completed their grueling journey into the territory. Left with nothing but a few tarnished coins and the child in her arms, Emily had become a ghost, wandering from one dusty settlement to the next, seeking the smallest measure of mercy. But the frontier was no place for pity. Its inhabitants were too consumed with the sheer effort of survival. Homesteaders were busy taming the land, wrestling sod houses into existence against the harsh, impending winters, and planting crops in the fertile, unforgiving soil that promised abundance, only if met with relentless sweat and sacrifice. Red Creek was little more than a dusty speck on a surveyor's map, a defiant cluster of rudimentary wooden buildings huddled around a single rutted main street. The saloon's swinging doors creaked a mournful tune in the breeze, and the general store's sign, advertising dry goods and provisions, swung lazily overhead, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Wagons rumbled past, raising clouds of ochre dust, loaded high with the essentials of survival. Flour sacks, heavy tools for breaking the stubborn earth, and bolts of durable fabric for mending clothes worn thin by the relentless toil. Men in wide-brimmed hats, their faces etched with deep lines from squinting against the merciless sun, nodded brief greetings to each other, while women in faded calico dresses hurried about, tending to restless children or bartering fiercely for scarce goods. The air was a pungent mix, smelling of dried horse manure, raw pine lumber, and the comforting, earthy scent of baking bread, a constant visceral reminder of the simple, grueling life demanded by this land. Emily approached the first door that seemed to offer a modicum of respectability, a modest boarding house with a sign that optimistically announced, "Rooms available." She knocked timidly, the rap sounding disproportionately loud in the sudden, brief lull of the wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A stout woman with iron-gray hair, pulled back severely from a perpetually worried forehead, opened the door, her eyes immediately narrowing at the sight of the disheveled, delicate stranger and the vulnerable bundle she held. "Please, ma'am," Emily began, her voice strained and thin, barely above a whisper. "I've lost my husband. We have nowhere to go. I can pay a little, and I can work. I can clean, cook, sew, anything, just for the night, until I can find something permanent." The woman shook her head slowly, her lips pursing into a tight line of disapproval. "We're full up," she stated, her voice dry and final. "Times are hard here, child. Can't take in every wanderer. We'd be overrun. Try the saloon. They might need a washerwoman to scrub down linens after the men get done drinking." Door after door yielded the same crushing response. The cold indifference of necessity was universal. Whispers followed her down the boardwalk. "Another widow. Poor thing. But we've got our own to feed." Emily's cheeks burned with a deep, humiliating shame, a feeling she had never known in her structured life back east. But the ingrained pride from her upbringing kept her from begging outright. She, who had been raised in a proper home where ladies sipped porcelain cups of tea and discussed the delicate plots of literature, was now scraping for survival on the raw, unpolished edge of civilization. As the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long skeletal shadows across the endless expanse of the plains. A kindly old man at the livery stable, his hands scarred from working with rope and leather, took pity on her. He pointed a gnarled finger toward a sparse grove of cottonwoods on the dusty outskirts of town. "There's a cabin yonder," he advised, his voice hushed with a hint of warning. "Belongs to Crow Black Horse. Half Sioux, they say. Big fella, keeps entirely to himself. Don't rent to nobody, never speaks to folks if he can help it. But, well, desperate times call for desperate measures, miss." Emily's stomach twisted with a complex mixture of fear and dread. The newspapers she had once read back home were filled with chilling stories of Native Americans, tales of wars, of the enforced confinement of reservations, and the lingering spectral presence of battles like Little Bighorn, which still haunted the minds of settlers. But the Sioux, or Dakota as some called them, had their own ways, ancient and intimately tied to the rhythm of the land. Crow, she knew from the town's hushed gossip, was a half-blood, scarred from some forgotten skirmish, or perhaps just the brutal reality of living between two warring worlds. He had lived alone since his people were forced onto reserves. He only came into town to chop wood for a meager wage, or to trade the pelts he trapped, and he spoke as little as possible. With the night approaching and no other choice left, Emily straightened her posture and trudged toward the cabin, the tall, dry grass swishing with a dry, hesitant sound against her heavy skirts. The woods were a sparse, struggling grove of cottonwoods and small pines, their leaves rustling like a soft, nervous applause in the evening breeze. The cabin soon emerged, a sturdy, well-built log structure with a robust stone chimney, from which a lazy column of smoke curled into the darkening sky. A small, sturdy corral held a single, lean horse, and meticulous stacks of firewood were lined neatly against the outer walls. Her knock, when it came, echoed with the hollow sound of a final, desperate plea. The heavy door creaked open halfway, revealing a towering, imposing figure. Crow Black Horse was broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his dark hair tied back in a simple, practical braid, his chest marked with faded, intricate scars, visible beneath the open neck of his rough linen shirt. His eyes, deep and entirely unreadable, fixed on her with an unnerving, steady intensity. I can pay," Emily stammered, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. She held out the single silver coin she possessed, which gleamed weakly in the fading light. "Just a corner of the floor, for one night, for my child." He remained utterly silent, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, his eyes shifted down, focusing intensely on the baby in her arms. Amelia stirred slightly, sensing the tension, her tiny fist clenching instinctively at the folds of Emily's shawl. Crow's severe expression softened, only marginally, but perceptibly, around the edges of his dark eyes. Without uttering a single unnecessary word, he stepped back, the door opening wider to grant her passage. Emily entered, her legs trembling with exhaustion and relief. The interior was remarkably simple and clean. A heavy wooden table, a stone hearth with a fire crackling brightly, and a single sturdy bed in the corner covered with thick hides. The air smelled strongly of pine, wood smoke, and a warm, pungent mixture of dried herbs, sage and perhaps cedar, a deep, earthy scent that was a subtle nod to his ancient heritage. She set her suitcase down with a quiet thud and rocked Amelia gently, whispering thanks that caught painfully in her throat. That night, as the wild prairie wind howled outside, mimicking the sound of her own deep-seated despair, Emily lay curled on a pallet of blankets near the fire. Amelia nestled securely beside her. Crow, in a silent gesture of respect and space, chose to sleep outside under the canopy of stars. Tears slipped silently down Emily's cheeks. Not tears of fear, but of the overwhelming, profound relief of having a solid roof over her head and a momentary reprieve from the judgment of the world. Little did she know that this hesitant, desperate arrival was not an ending, but the tentative beginning of something profound and unexpected. The first few days under Crow's roof blurred into a stark, quiet rhythm of survival that felt both isolating and strangely comforting. Crow Blackhorse was a man defined by the vast, uncommunicative silence of the plains. He rose well before the first hint of dawn, his movements deliberate and silent, despite his imposing size. Emily would wake, not to the sound of his voice, but to the rhythmic, powerful thud of his axe splitting wood, the sound echoing through the crisp morning air like a heartbeat. He would then vanish into the dense riverside brush, returning hours later with game, a brace of plump rabbits or a string of creek fish, which he would clean meticulously and leave on the wooden table without any comment or expectation. Emily, a woman whose life had previously been governed by a complex etiquette, felt grateful but perpetually awkward. She struggled to find ways to make herself useful, to repay the immense, unspoken debt. She swept the packed dirt floor until it was immaculate, mended a persistent tear in one of his heavy shirts with her fine sewing kit, and kept water boiling for the harsh, strong black coffee, the kind Thomas had liked. The baby, Amelia, thrived in the sudden stability, her small coos, and gurgles filling the silences from her makeshift cradle, a sturdy willow basket lined with soft blankets Emily had managed to save. Crow spoke in monosyllables, a guttural grunt here, a brief, definitive nod there. His presence was as immense and unmovable as the plains themselves, vast, steady, and entirely impenetrable. Emily often watched him from the narrow, deep-set window as he tended a small, purposeful garden behind the cabin, planting corn, beans, and squash in the traditional mounds his mother had taught him. She had learned from the snippets of town gossip that his father had been a white trapper, his mother a Lakota woman from the Standing Rock area. The mixing of blood had left him a figure of perpetual suspicion and isolation, a man stranded in the painful chasm between two hostile worlds. One afternoon, as the golden sunlight filtered through the leaves of the cottonwoods, painting dappled patterns on the ground, Emily ventured outside with Amelia secured snugly in her arms. Crow was working on repairing a section of the sturdy corral fence, his broad back to her. His muscles flexed and rippled under the rough linen of his shirt with each powerful stroke of the hammer. She approached hesitantly, unsure of disrupting his concentration. "Thank you," she said softly, clutching Amelia a little tighter, "for letting us stay. I truly don't know what we'd have done. You saved us." He paused his work instantly, his hammer arrested mid-swing. He wiped a streak of sweat from his brow with the back of a hand, calloused like dried leather. His eyes met hers, dark, bottomless pools that seemed to hold centuries of untold stories and trauma. "Child needs shelter," he finally murmured, his voice a low, rough sound, like gravel shifting underfoot. It was the longest sentence he had yet spoken to her, and the gravity of it made Emily shiver slightly. Emily simply nodded, her throat suddenly tight with overwhelming, unmanageable emotion. She thought inevitably of Thomas, and how he had promised her a life of grand adventure and security, only to leave her utterly alone in the face of this brutal reality. The raw, sharp edges of her grief washed over her in unexpected heavy waves, but she pushed it down violently, forcing herself to focus on the immediate, tangible present. As days reluctantly bled into a week, then two, small tentative gestures began to bridge the immense chasm of silence between them. Crow, without being asked, would bring back handfuls of sweet wild berries from the woods, placing them gently in a clean wooden bowl for her consumption. Emily, in turn, baked a batch of dense cornbread using the flour she had bought in town, consciously leaving a generous portion for him near his workspace. They ate separately at first, their meals silent and punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. But one cool evening, as a sudden heavy rainstorm began to relentlessly patter on the roof, he wordlessly joined her at the small table. There were still no words, just the shared vital warmth of the flickering fire and the intimate unspoken knowledge that they were both surviving, together. Emily's thoughts raced in the deepening quiet. "What am I doing here?" she constantly asked herself. "I am a proper lady, educated and refined, living in a half-blood stranger's remote home. But the sheer unforgiving necessity of her situation had completely rewritten the rules of her life. And in the vast, almost spiritual silence of Crow Blackhorse, she began to discover a strange, fragile peace. There were no draining expectations, no social judgments, only the steady, consistent reality of the man himself. Emily's memories of her previous life haunted the cabin like subtle, lingering ghosts on the constant prairie wind. Back east, in a bustling red brick town in Ohio, she had married Thomas at the bright, hopeful age of 19. He was a clerk, polite and well-mannered, but driven by grandiose, restless dreams of the West, constantly inspired by the tales of free land and quick fortunes circulating under the Homestead Act. Their journey had begun with optimism, a cramped, jostling train ride followed by weeks in a slow, jarring wagon traversing the fading echoes of the Dakota boom, a period where the population had exploded in the 1880s, only to be crushed by subsequent droughts and devastating economic woes. By 1891, the testing of the settlers had become relentless. Thomas had staked his claim to a promising plot of land near Red Creek, but the devastating illness had struck swiftly and without warning. Emily had nursed him through 3 fevered, horrific nights, the stench of his sickness thick in the confined soddy. But he had slipped away with the coming of the dawn, leaving her with the newly born Amelia. The homestead was immediately lost to the crushing weight of debts. She had no family left to return to, and thus the solitary journey had begun. In the simple confines of the cabin, Emily began to share small, fragmented bits of her story during the rare occasions when Crow offered an opening. "He was a good man," she told him one quiet evening as he patiently whittled a piece of cedar wood by the fire, the shavings curling around his hands. "He wanted so badly to build a grand life for us, to matter." Crow nodded once, his knife carving smooth, purposeful curves into the wood. "Land takes much," he murmured, not looking up. "It demands everything you have. Gives little back sometimes." His quiet words felt like a key, gently opening a minuscule crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. Emily learned, piece by painful piece, about his own profound losses. He had lost his mother, a gentle Lakota woman, when he was just a young boy, raised only by his white father, until the man was killed in a sudden, brutal hunting accident. Crow had wandered extensively after that, avoiding the reservations where his people were confined after treaties like the Treaty of Fort Laramie were repeatedly broken and ignored. He had never been a soldier in any official war, but bore visible scars from constant, often random skirmishes with panicked or hostile settlers over territory and resources. "I live between worlds," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the hypnotizing dance of the flames, the cedar carving forgotten in his lap. Not white, not full Lakota, just a shadow between 2 fires. Emily's heart swelled with a rush of profound, empathetic sorrow. "We're all between something," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I am no longer the lady I was raised to be, nor the pioneer wife I thought I'd become. We are just here." Amelia, the child, unknowingly became the most vital, living bridge between them. The baby's cries would sometimes pierce the heavy silence of the night, and Emily, already exhausted from the grueling days of chores, washing laundry in the icy creek, grinding tough corn for their meal, struggled to soothe her. On one such night, as the baby-s cries escalated into high-pitched wails and tears streamed down Emily's face from sheer fatigue, Crow rose from his pallet. He approached cautiously and lifted Amelia gently, his large, powerful hands cradling her small body like a precious, fragile bird. He began to hum a soft, melodic tune, a traditional Lakota lullaby his mother had sung to him years ago. "Hush now, little one. The stars watch over you. Mother Moon sings soft. Nothing will harm you." The melody was simple, pentatonic, rising and falling with a natural rhythm like the hills themselves. Emily watched, completely transfixed, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You're good with her," she whispered, amazement coloring her voice. His voice suddenly cracked, the rough texture smoothing into something vulnerable. "Had a daughter once," he admitted, his gaze locked on the child's face, Fever took her. Wife, too. Long ago. The magnitude of the revelation hung heavy and thick in the small cabin's air. Emily, without thinking, reached out and gently touched his forearm, a spark of profound, instantaneous connection passing between them. She would have been proud, Emily said, tears filling her own eyes for his loss. That you still know how to love and care for a child. A single silent tear escaped his eye, tracking a clean path through the dust on his cheek. The first, undeniable sign of vulnerability Emily had ever witnessed in him. That night, lying awake near the silent, sleeping man and the quiet child, she felt the rigid walls of her own grief and isolation finally begin to crumble. As the weeks reluctantly stretched into a full month, the log structure slowly but inevitably transformed from a temporary shelter into a nascent, shared home. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, losing its awkward tension and settling into a quiet rhythm of mutual respect and cooperation. Emily began to actively help in the small garden, learning Crow's meticulous, patient ways. He taught her the wisdom of the three sisters, planting corn, beans, and squash together in supportive mounds. They are sisters, he explained, his hands demonstrating the technique. They stand strong together. The corn is the strength, the bean is the nourishment, and the squash is the shade and the blanket. Emily found a deep, unexpected resonance in the metaphor of communal support, a comfort that spoke directly to her solitary soul. Their exchanges became longer, less guarded. They began to share stories under the immense, starry canopy of the Dakota sky. Emily spoke of the books she loved, Jane Austen's structured tales of love and society, which now felt impossibly distant and trivial. Crow, in turn, recounted the ancient, vital Lakota legends, the profound teaching of the white buffalo calf woman who brought the sacred pipe and the 7 essential ceremonies, or the story of Maka, earth, and Skan, sky. As he spoke, his low, resonant voice infused the familiar landscape with a new, sacred meaning, making the cottonwoods and the rolling hills seem like living entities. In these quiet, shared moments, the seeds of emotional intimacy took root. Emily found an undeniable, quiet anchor in Crow's formidable presence. His strength was not aggressive or demanding, but steady and certain, like the deep-rooted cottonwood trees. Crow, who had chosen isolation for so long to protect himself from further hurt, found a profound solace in Emily's innate gentleness and the warmth of Amelia's small, vibrant life. Their touches began to linger, a brief, accidental brush of a hand on the shoulder during work, fingers consciously touching when passing a communal bowl of food. These moments were electric, profound in their rarity. Emily began learning traditional Lakota customs, a quiet act of respect that deeply touched Crow. She watched him prepare wakan, sacred herbs for teas, and learned the delicate, meditative skill of beadwork, using tiny, colorful glass beads he acquired in trade. She taught him to read excerpts from her worn copy of the Bible, which he treated with careful, quiet reverence, fascinated by the parallel stories of faith and human struggle. One bright, clear afternoon, the ugly reality of town prejudice brutally intruded upon their sanctuary. Emily had gone into Red Creek to purchase much-needed supplies and heard the inevitable, cutting whispers. She's still out there, living with that half-breed. Shameful, the way some women carry on after losing a husband. She returned to the cabin, her face pale, the sharp humiliation stinging her eyes. She confided the whole incident in Crow, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain. Crow listened silently, leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable as always. When she finished, he simply held her gaze, a profound, steady intensity in his dark eyes. "They fear what they don't know," he said, his voice flat. "They fear anything that lives outside their fence lines, outside their laws. They fear what they cannot claim as their own." He paused, then his eyes softened slightly, a rare tenderness entering his voice. "But you," he finished, his voice barely a murmur. "You see me. You see the man, not the blood." It was the profound, honest validation she desperately needed. Their shared struggle against the town's silent, pervasive judgment solidified their fragile, blossoming bond. It was an intimacy forged in defiance and mutual respect, a love that was beginning to bloom like the hardy wildflowers after a long, difficult reign. Grief, Emily discovered, was not a wound that disappeared, but a constant, heavy companion. Yet, when shared, it became a burden that inexplicably lightened, like two people carrying a great stone. She would still dream vividly of Thomas, of his earnest face, the smell of pipe tobacco on his coat, waking suddenly in the pre-dawn darkness, tears silently streaming down her face. Crow would be instantly awake, a shadow in the darkness, and would comfort her with a quiet, solid presence, often saying the same simple words. The heart mends slow, Emily. It does not forget, but it mends. In turn, Crow began to speak more openly about his lost wife, Leah, and their daughter, Little Star. He spoke of the bitter cold of that final winter, the failure of the government to deliver promised supplies, and the swift, brutal fever that had claimed them both in the span of 3 days. His story was a devastating portrait of systemic neglect and personal heartbreak. Emily learned that Little Star had loved to chase butterflies, and that Leah had woven the most intricate designs into her clothing. They began a ritual of walking the plains together every afternoon. Amelia secured comfortably in a woven sling Crow had crafted from leather and canvas. These walks were not simply exercise, they were an act of emotional reckoning and a deep connection to the land. Crow pointed out the vast, sweeping beauty of the land to her, detailing the indigenous plants and their healing uses. He pointed to the majestic eagles that often circled overhead, high on the thermals, explaining that in Lakota belief, the eagle was a sacred messenger, symbolizing the Wakantanka, Great Spirit, and the connection between earth and sky. "We walk with the spirits," he explained to her once, watching the magnificent birds soar. "Our lost ones are not gone. They are up there. They are the wind. They are the light." Emily felt a profound sense of life reawakening within her. The prairie, which had initially represented only her loneliness and abandonment, slowly began to feel like a vast, living tapestry of resilience. Her old life, structured by parlor rules and social graces, seemed impossibly stifling now. Here, beneath the immense sky, her true self, the weary, heartbroken, but fundamentally strong woman, could breathe. They shared the simple, repetitive duties that formed the backbone of their lives. Emily taught Crow how to make her mother's thick, comforting stew with dumplings. He taught her how to tan deer hide until it was butter soft. They would sit for hours, side by side, silent, yet profoundly connected, Amelia cooing and gurgling between them. These moments were not defined by grand passion or sweeping gestures, but by the quiet, sustained rhythm of mutual, unconditional care. Their emotional landscape was subtly reflected in the natural world around the cabin. When Emily felt her grief sharpen, a sudden cold wind would sweep through the cottonwoods, the rustling leaves sounding like a sigh. When she felt moments of peace and connection with Crow, the sun would pour down, hot and comforting, turning the endless grass into shimmering gold. The plains were not just a backdrop. They were a living, breathing testament to the healing process. The turning point was subtle, almost imperceptible. One evening, Crow returned from a long day of trapping, covered in mud and exhausted. Emily, without hesitation, drew a basin of warm water and, kneeling beside him, began to wash the dirt from his hands and arms. It was an act of profound, tender servitude, utterly devoid of any sexual connotation, yet it felt more intimate than any kiss. When she finished, he simply looked at her, his eyes dark with a gratitude that went far beyond the small act. "You have kindness in your bones," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You have strength in your heart, Crow," she replied, her eyes steady. "You let me stay. You let me start over." They realized then that they were no longer two separate, wounded people sharing a space. They were a small, unified unit, defined by shared loss and a common, profound need for safety and connection. The storm was not merely weather. It was a violent, physical manifestation of the internal chaos that still resided in their hearts. It struck the plains late in the autumn, a sudden, furious confluence of howling wind and torrential rain that lasted for 3 relentless, terrifying days. The temperature plummeted, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and primal danger. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of quiet stability, became a drumming, rattling cage. The wind tore at the log walls, shrieking through the cracks, and the rain hammered the roof with the insistent beat of 1,000 drummers. Confined inside, with the light reduced to the flickering, moody glow of the stone hearth, the immense space that had existed between them seemed to shrink to an almost unbearable proximity. They worked together to keep the fire stoked, speaking in low, clipped tones over the constant din of the gale. Amelia, surprisingly, slept soundly through most of it, nestled safely in her cradle, a silent witness to the rising emotional tension. On the second night, the storm seemed to peak. A massive gust of wind hit the chimney, sending a plume of smoke and embers into the room. Crow immediately sprang up, fighting to secure the chimney damper, his large frame momentarily silhouetted against the firelight. He turned back, his face streaked with ash, and found Emily standing rigid, staring into the flames. "Emily?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. She shook her head, tears welling up, not for the storm, but for the raw, unprotected memory it had dragged forth. "It was like this," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "The night Thomas died, the fever. The wind was so loud I couldn't hear his breathing. I thought if I could just stop the wind, he'd be all right." She crumpled onto the floor, the full, suffocating weight of her unresolved guilt and trauma hitting her with the force of the gale outside. Crow moved instantly, lowering himself beside her, pulling her close into the deep, safe embrace of his strong arms. "You could not stop the fever," he murmured into her hair, his own voice heavy with the memory of his losses. "You could not stop the wind. You fought for him. You lived for your daughter. That is all there is." His words were not just comfort. They were a heavy, shared absolution, grounding her in the present reality of the storm and their mutual survival. In the darkness, amidst the relentless clamor of the storm, the dam finally broke. Confessions poured out like the rain outside. Emily spoke of her fear that she was not strong enough to be a mother, a widow, a pioneer, or to ever be worthy of peace again. Crow spoke of the crippling guilt he felt for surviving his wife and daughter, of the persistent shame of his mixed blood that made him unwelcome everywhere, and his absolute primal fear of ever loving someone again, knowing the crushing certainty of loss was always watching. "I love you," Emily whispered into the rough cloth of his shirt, the 3 simple words emerging not as a desperate plea for reassurance, but as an undeniable profound truth, a recognition of safety and belonging she never thought she'd find. Crow froze, his powerful body going rigid against hers. He pulled back slightly, his dark eyes searching hers in the dim light, the firelight catching the moisture of his own tears. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress around his heart, a structure designed to withstand every loss and rejection, and her simple, honest words were the first true threat to its walls. "I cannot lose again," he admitted, the words barely audible over the wind, thick with the concentrated weight of years of unspoken grief. "The price is too high." "You won't lose me," Emily promised, her gaze steady, refusing to allow him to retreat. She reached up, her thumb gently touching the faint, silvery scar just below his cheekbone, a permanent mark of his own battles. "We are already lost, Crow. We were ghosts walking through the world, and now we have found each other in the wilderness. If you love me, let us be found together." Her confidence was a silent challenge, demanding that he choose life and connection over fear and isolation. He closed his eyes, the battle raging within him, a silent, fierce war between the instinct to flee and the undeniable pull toward her warmth. But the sheer force of the storm, The intimacy of the cramped space and the quiet, undeniable truth shining in Emily's eyes finally overpowered his carefully constructed defenses. He lowered his head, and their lips met. Not in a kiss of urgency or sudden passion, but one of overwhelming, tender recognition and commitment. It was a solemn vow sealed in the heart of the storm, a commitment to face the world and its unpredictable cruelty as a unified front. The storm outside seemed, in that moment, to immediately soften, retreating slightly as if it had served its final, crucial purpose. That night, they moved from their separate pallets to the one bed, an act of mutual comfort, survival, and deep, profound necessity rather than conquest. They held each other tightly beneath the heavy hides, seeking not passion, but the profound, quiet, healing reassurance of another human heart, beating resolutely in time with their own, a rhythm against the enduring beat of the prairie. The spring that followed the great storm arrived with a vibrant, almost miraculous explosion of life. The plains were awash in the startling greens of new growth, and the air smelled fresh, clean, and full of promise. Emily and Crow decided to marry quietly, an event born of necessity and profound love, entirely outside the judgmental eye of Red Creek. They blended their traditions in a simple, deeply meaningful ceremony under the immense blue sky. Crow led her to a small, secluded bluff overlooking the Red Creek itself, where the cottonwoods stood tall and unbent. He laid out a blanket and gently burned sacred sage, the smoke curling around them, cleansing and marking the space as holy. Emily brought her worn family Bible, and they read aloud a passage about faith and resilience. Crow took her hand, palm up, and spoke his vows in Lakota, a language Emily didn't fully understand but whose meaning resonated in the solemnity of his voice. He finished, switching to English. "We walk the earth together. What the Great Spirit has given, no man can take." Emily responded simply, "I take you, Crow, as my husband, my anchor, and my home. Where you stand, I stand." They exchanged simple rings. A smooth band of silver Crow had hammered himself, and Thomas's plain gold band which Emily wore on her right hand as a sign of remembrance and continuation, not replacement. Their commitment, solid and unshakable, slowly began to change the perception of the town. Emily no longer hid. She would walk into the general store, her head held high, Crow's presence a solid, visible support beside her. They kept their distance from the townspeople, but they were not ashamed. The sheer, evident happiness that radiated from their small family unit, the way Crow held Amelia, the quiet, shared glances between the couple, was a silent testament that eventually softened even the most hardened hearts. A few older women, widows themselves, started to nod their approval. The man was rough, yes, but he was a provider, and he clearly adored his new family. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the relentless, fulfilling toil of the land. Crow expanded his small homestead, building a second larger room onto the cabin and a solid barn for a second horse and a few head of cattle. Emily taught Amelia, who grew into a bright, resilient girl with her mother's eyes and her father's solemn quietude, to read, write, and to tend the three sisters' garden. Amelia called Crow Papa without hesitation, and he taught her to identify the tracks of every animal on the prairie, to speak the foundational Lakota words for sun, moon, and water, and to shoot a slingshot straight and true. Their family grew again. 5 years after their marriage, a son was born. A robust, noisy boy they named Thomas, after Emily's first husband, honoring the past while embracing the future. He was followed by a little girl, Leah, named for Crow's first love. The cabin was no longer quiet. It was filled with the clamor of children, the deep, warm smell of cooking bread, the rattle of a cradle, and the constant, low-voiced murmurs of a man and a woman who had found sanctuary in each other. On a cool, clear evening, years into their marriage, Emily sat with Crow on the porch they had built, watching their children play in the long, golden light of the sunset. Amelia, now a young woman, was already exhibiting her mother's gentle strength and her father's profound connection to the land. Emily leaned her head against Crow's strong shoulder, his arm instinctively wrapping around her. "I used to think my heart was broken forever," she murmured, watching the children's silhouettes against the immense sky. Crow simply squeezed her shoulder, his gaze sweeping across the plains they had claimed together, not by title or law, but by love and grit. "The heart mends, Emily," he said, his voice deep and certain, echoing the words he had spoken to her so long ago. "It mends stronger than before, because it knows what it lost and what it kept." The wind, no longer a mournful bearer of despair, whispered softly across the golden grasses, carrying the sound of children's laughter, the beautiful, final harmony of a family built on the wide, wild plains.